5. The Stockholm Conference Revolt. Oil Committee International. The way in which Taghi Fawad from Iran and myself got along, you would have thought we knew each other since high school days. I re-established contact with Taghi in 1969, just after my graduation from Miami University with an MA degree in economics. By this time, I had bought my first automobile and was now keen to drive the 8 hours to Washington University to touch base with my Iranian brother Taghi Fawad. Beknownst to these guys, I arrived in St. Louis, Missouri in the fall of 1969, just to find them in an exciting meeting of students working out of Barry Commoner's office. Barry Commoner was an American cellular biologist, college professor, and practicing political lobbyist. He was always lobbying politicians at the United Nations to do something about the environment. As the director of the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems, Commoner had always insisted that scientists, including his students, had an obligation to make scientific information accessible to the general public so that citizens could participate in public debates that involved scientific questions. Today, Barry Commoner is remembered as the father of the modern environmental movement. He died in 2012. Among Barry Commoner's students was Taghi Fawad, who had just completed his thesis on, quote, pesticide residue in mother's milk in Guatemala, end quote. Somehow, Taghi had returned to St. Louis with a Guatemalan parrot. He really wanted his parrot to learn to speak English, but the only sound the parrot would make were oi, oi. This group started to greet each other with the same salutation of oi, and later adopted the name OI Committee International, and a mission statement that said, a dedication to the holistic study of international development and human environment. It all sounded reasonable. A special shout out is in order for the unspoken heroes of the OI Committee International. They were Doro Ochibe, a medical doctor from Nigeria, teaching us about the medical practices and especially about the sterilization programs of the USAID, which was designed to bring about population control and more development with smaller population growth. Ahmed Taghi Fawad of Iran, an environmentalist who defended indigenous communities and spoke against the way in which the colonial thinking equated conservation of the environment with the removal of the original people from their ancestral homes. Francisco Seque of Mexico, who effectively dismantled the illusions created by traditional economists to expose the injustice and inhumanity inherent in the current economic system. Deepak Bhattacharya of Nepal, an entomologist who spoke about using science to improve the living conditions of communities living in the high altitudes of his native Nepal. Georgine Primavera of the Philippines, who taught us all the importance of preserving the wetlands. Alan Wynne Williams of Guyana, who critiqued the historical thinking of how market fundamentalism had produced on the global scale forms of exploitation and oppression, especially in relation to the environment. The 1972 Stockholm Conference Revolt. The piece de resistance for the Oil Committee International, however, was the 1972 Stockholm Conference. The Nations Conference on Human Environment was held in Stockholm, Sweden from June the 5th to 16th in 1972. This was the first world conference to make the environment a major issue. We in the Oil Committee had been preparing for this in consultation with the lobbying efforts of Barry Commoner. Not only were we going to be there, but we were equally determined to ensure that the dialogue in the conference was steered towards our concerns. There were two simultaneous gatherings in Stockholm. The official conference was attended by accredited representatives of the UN member states, and the Environmental Forum was the platform for scientists and other technical personnel. The Environmental Forum was expected to generate the data and information to be used to guide the authors of the declarations to be adopted at the plenary of the official conference. Our accreditation was to the Environmental Forum, but we were not accredited as the Oil Committee International, but rather as part of Barry Commoner's Center for the Biology of Natural Systems. There were other NGO forums. The People's Forum died down. The Environmental Forum, however, had the official blessing of the UN conference. The Environmental Forum got off to a very boring start. The issue was not so much the participants as it was the cadre of speakers. The first 2 days saw various high-level academics touting their research on so many esoteric subjects that, frankly speaking, we were all getting bored. A decision was made by the Oil Committee members to stop attending the forum and instead to occupy the forum. Some of you may remember a movement called Occupy Wall Street that came to the forefront of protest movements in 2011. Well, the Oil Committee was a mini forerunner of that type of activism. We resolved to take over this forum and replace the agenda with a new agenda. The date for our little coup was set for Wednesday, June the 7th, 1972, at a session to be chaired by a British Member of Parliament, Lord Carrington. I remembered as he gavelled the session to order, participants were slowly taking their seats, and he was anxious to get his boring show on the road. I was assigned to take care of this English aristocrat because someone in our group had gotten the wrong impression that he was once a governor of Jamaica. "It's your people, Jagans. Take care of it," was Staggy's exhortation. I'm not sure whether he thought that I had come onto the stage to help bring the session to order. He just stepped aside, and I took the microphone to announce that the forum agenda had been changed, that these folks on the stage would no longer be speaking, and that we had a new panel and a new agenda. I distinctly remember his exchange with me. "You can't just come and steal the mic from me like that. Don't speak to me about stealing. Your great-granddaddy stole my great-granddaddy from Africa and brought them to Jamaica. I'm sorry about the misfortune of your progenitors, but my family wealth did not come from plantation and slaves." Disregarding that short exchange, I nevertheless proceeded to announce the new agenda for the forum. I had written up a new agenda, as was decided in our group meeting, and produced it as a one-page bulletin, and had planned that our members, who by then had included other NGOs than the Oil Committee, should start distributing it around the hall. The new agenda had one major message, and it was this: 2/3 of the world will not stay poor so that the other 1/3 can remain rich. As such, we insisted on addressing such issues as the condemnation of apartheid and colonialism, wildlife and nature resources had to be safeguarded, non-renewable resources must be shared, not exhausted, developing countries needed reasonable prices for their exports so as to finance environmental management. Environmental concerns must not be used to impede economic development, and damaging pollution of the oceans must be avoided. The press went wild with this new turn of events. We had all sorts of persons who wanted to speak on various panels, and so we were kept busy organizing new presentations for the remaining sessions. The whole occasion was a success. Even Lord Carrington seemed to have agreed, as he later gave me his calling card and invited me to meet with him the next time I was in London. Yes, sure, Your Lordship. Success at the UN Conference. The changes that emerged in the Stockholm Conference were recorded by Takeyawa Prempe in an article about the creation of international environmental law. In that article, he stated, initially it was envisaged that purely economic matters would be on the agenda, but developing countries wanted development considered alongside environmental issues, arguing that development was an issue integral to all their other concerns, including environmental matters. UNGA, that is the UN General Assembly, accepted and incorporated development considerations at the preparatory stage. Thus, the main conference was a success as most of our agenda dialogue did find its way into the declarations of the conference. For instance, the official report of the conference accepted as part of its premises that in the developing countries, most of the environmental problems are caused by underdevelopment. Millions continue to live far below the minimum level required for a decent human existence, deprived of adequate food and clothing, shelter and education, health and sanitation. The point has been reached in history when we must shape our actions throughout the world with a more prudent care for their environmental consequences. The plenary session of the official conference adopted 26 principles of common conviction. Principle 4 stated that man had a special responsibility to safeguard and wisely manage the heritage of wildlife and its habitat, which are now gravely imperiled by a combination of adverse factors. Nature conservation, including wildlife, must therefore receive importance in planning for economic development. Likewise, Principle 10 expounded on the idea that for the developing countries, stability of prices and adequate earnings for primary commodities and raw materials are essential to environmental management, since economic factors as well as ecological processes must be taken into account. The NGO community had insisted on the generic reference to man, meaning humankind, in the leading principles. Our committee had always held to the belief that human well-being was essential for environmental safety. We were most pleased to note that in the adopted principles, it was only after Principle 11 that the first mention was made of actions by political states. Today, the United Nations celebrates June the 5th as World Environmental Day, a day for encouraging worldwide awareness and action to protect our environment. From our perspective, it should be celebrated on June the 7th, the day when the Oil Committee and our cohorts occupied the Environmental Forum and provided meaningful content to the Declaration of the Environmental Principles. It is notable that it took 25 years for the environmental consequences of market fundamentalism, such as global warming and climate change, to seize center stage. These battles are now being fought by institutions as high up the totem pole as the space agencies NASA, and by lowly persons in their struggle for environmental justice in the courts. In the battle against climate change, the courts have now become the front line. In May 2021, a court ruling ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut its emission by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels. This Dutch district court concluded that Shell's climate plan was not concrete enough and that meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement was not only up to governments. In the same week, the federal court in Australia found that the Minister for the Environment owed a duty of care to Australian children who would suffer potentially catastrophic harm from the climate change implications of approving extension to coal mine. Andy Rain, head of the International Law Unit at the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, commented, "Courts are increasingly holding companies and governments to account for their responsibilities to address climate change. History is slowly vindicating us. Hijacked by radical Iranian students. We in the OI committee had always believed that people act on the basis of their perceptions of reality, but we never really gave much thought to the fact that some perceptions could be built on false insight. That was a battle against malicious propaganda. Well, one afternoon, while I was in the basement where we held our command headquarters in Stockholm, I was accosted by a group of radical Iranian students. The short version of the story is as follows. I would usually take a bus from our hotel to the convention space every morning. At the same time, this beautiful Iranian lady would be on the bus. We soon introduced ourselves to each other and would have our chit chat during the short ride to the convention center. The lady happened to be Fatima Farman Farmayan, an author who would go on in her illustrious career to produce a collection of essays and articles on environmental issues relating to economic development. In Iran, during the period of the Shah, family names had historical meanings. Surnames in particular had evolved as a way to sort people into groups by occupation, place of origin, clan affiliation, patronage, parentage, adoption, and even physical characteristics like red hair. The Farman Farmayan family name was one of these. They were the descendants of Hossein Ali Farman Farma and his predecessors, with roots in the Qajar dynasty, which dynasty was overthrown by the Shah's father Reza Khan. Upshot of all this was that this group of Iranian students were observing my daily morning meetings with this member of the Farman Farmayan family and were convinced that she was using me to spy on the Iranians in the conference. Actually, these students were on their way to warn Taghi about their discovery of the spy in our midst when they ran into me in the basement and thought they should just take things into their own hands. Hijacking me up against the wall, they began shouting all sorts of accusations in Farsi. Of course, I did not understand anything they were saying. Taghi came out of the office and, seeing the commotion, intervened and asked them what this was about. They explained to him my nefarious behavior. Amazing to me was how Taghi was able to defuse the situation without any counter-violence. It reminded me of when I once tried to defuse a conflict situation during the race riots in Georgetown, and the very people who would be my tribe instead turned on me with kicks and spit. Taghi was part Turkish Iranian and his mother was Azerbaijan. These young radicals had still not broken the bonds of respect commingled with tacit submission to Iranians who looked like Taghi.